Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In the last episode, things were going great. The Duchess had a birthday, and she went with her husband and King George V and Queen Mary to yacht races, which was very exciting. And then later in the year, King George V got ill again, and this time he didn't make it through. He was very loved by his family and by the people of the United Kingdom. So let's find out what will happen today. King Edward VIII came to the throne with public enthusiasm. Everyone expected a lot out of him. He was thought to be able to bridge the gap between generations. He was an ex-soldier, so it was thought that he could relate to the needs of the former soldiers. He had traveled a lot, so he had a special understanding of the lands of the empire and beyond. It was thought that he would be as steadfast as his father, but more up-to-date and more flexible. King Edward enjoyed the extra sympathy he got at first. He was unmarried and a childless man, and his job would be a lonely one. The Duchess of York's lady-in-waiting looked over at him during the funeral service for the king and said, "I feel so sorry for him. He's not going home to a wife behind the teapot and a warm fire with his children making toast for him." When he was a prince early on, he found many of his official duties irksome, and George warned the prince that if he was to be a constitutional monarch, he must first be a constitutional Prince of Wales. The king saw the prince's indifference and lack of respect for manners and morals. He thought the feeling would damage or destroy the monarchy. King Edward VIII and the Duke of York at one point were very close, and the Duchess loved the prince's naughty company. By the early 1930s, the lifestyles between the brothers had changed. The Yorks were in domestic bliss, and the Prince of Wales was a man about the town. He took up flying, and he summered on the Riviera, and he spent many long evenings entertaining his friends in the chic London nightclubs. His favorite home was Fort Belvedere, which the king had granted him in 1929. It was down the road from Royal Lodge. Diana Cooper said the home was a child's idea of a fort with its slotted walls and towers, and it was the complete opposite of Windsor Castle, the greatest castle in the land. The prince's place was for fun, and it was there the prince and his guests could relax and enjoy themselves with little rules. King George and Queen Mary wanted the prince to marry and have children. The king was just interested in fooling around. He was having affairs with married women and other shorter relationships. On a winter weekend in January 1933, the Yorks went ice skating near the fort with the prince and Thelma and Furness. And there was another member there of the skate party, and it was Mrs. Ernest Simpson. So we'll find out a little bit about Wallis Simpson. She was born to a good Baltimore family, but her early life was penniless. Her father died when she was 2, and her mother at that time ran a boarding house. From her childhood on, she learned that security came from money. She married a man named Winfield Spencer. He was a handsome pilot, but he was an alcoholic, and she divorced him in 1922. In 1928, she married a man named Ernest Simpson. He was a kind Anglo-American and was good-looking, and they made their home in London. Wallis was socially ambitious, and she was a friend of Thelma Furness, and that's how she met the Prince of Wales. The prince liked her glamour and her sharp wit. He thought she was clever, she was brusque, she was self-possessed, and she was completely unimpressed by royalty. And that was unlike the English women that he knew. She was the first one that talked down to him. She said what she wanted, and what she wanted she generally got. In early 1934, Thelma made a mistake of taking a 3-month trip to the United States, and she asked Wallis Simpson to keep an eye on the prince in her absence. That was a mistake, of course. Within weeks, the prince was under her spell. He frequently invited her and her husband to weekends at the fort, while taking her dancing, and during the intervening weeks without her husband. When Thelma got back, she saw that Wallis had replaced her. She and another woman he had been fooling around with, Freda Dudley Ward, were cut off. Prince George was the closest to his brother, the Prince of Wales, and he lived with him at St. James Palace and spent many weekends at the fort. He saw that Simpson was trying to dominate his brother and isolate him from his family, and this, of course, concerned the king and queen. Later, he said that after she came into his life, the Prince of Wales family never saw him, as in days gone by. Through 1934 and 1935, the prince didn't mind displaying his fascination with Mrs. Simpson. The press kept silent because of the monarchy, and the American press rejoiced in the story, and the talk grew in London society. People in and around the court talked about Mrs. Simpson's total control over the prince. The king went to his son and asked him about it, and the prince denied that he was doing anything. Unlike most people, the king took him at his word. The king didn't like his son's behavior. He said he is not a single friend who is a gentleman. He does not see any decent society, and he is 41. A few months before he died, the king was reported to have said, "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." So I'm glad his prayers were answered about that. By 1935, the prince's family and close friends were fascinated by Mrs. Simpson, and private speculation at the time and much later, her hold on him was partially sexual. His biographer said that it may have been true, but there was more to the relationship than just sex. Until the day he died, his eyes would follow her around the room. If she set out, he would grow anxious. It was her personality, not her appearance or her sexual technique, that captivated him. Some thought that even before the king died, the prince had decided to renounce his right to the succession and go off with Mrs. Simpson. That was the opinion of King George V's private secretaries. Alan Lascelles later stated that King Edward himself told him in the summer of 1936 that he had not wanted to become a king. His brother confirmed this. Shortly before the abdication, the new king, George VI, remarked to Owen Morshead, "He never meant to take it on. You see, Papa's death fell wrongly for his plans. It would have been easy to chuck it while he was a Prince of Wales. He would have had a rough crossing with Papa, but he would have faced up to that." The author of the book, The Queen Mother, said it would not have been simple for the Prince of Wales to chuck it. That legislation would have been required in Britain and the Dominions to alter the line of succession. His father's death had trapped him, and that's why he probably had such a display of emotion when his father died. The Prince of Wales' anguish deepened 2 days later when the king's will was read to the family. He found out that his father had left him a life interest in Sandringham and Balmoral, but unlike his siblings, he was to receive no money. Clive Wigham and the king's solicitor, Sir Bernard Beauchamp, explained to him that George V had expected that, like the previous princes of Wales, he would have built himself a nest egg out of his Duchy of Cornwall revenues, and that his siblings had no such income. It was later discovered that the prince had accumulated a considerable fortune, but the prince was still angry about being left no money. He left the room to telephone the bad news to Mrs. Simpson. Senior members of the household began to despair at the priorities of the new king. Sir Godfrey Thomas, his private secretary for many years as the Prince of Wales, was convinced that he was not fit to be king and that his reign would end in disaster. Alec Hardinge became the new king's secretary, and he found it even more difficult than he had expected to adjust to it. His wife had written in her diary the problems he was having. March the 10th, Alec, late as usual, owing to the new king's strange hours. March 27th, confusion in the king's affairs because he's so impractical. March 31st, Alec very much depressed by His Majesty's irresponsibility. And the Duchess of York felt a void with the death of the king. She wrote to Lord Dawson, "Unlike his own children, I was never afraid of him, and all the 12 years of having me as a daughter-in-law, he never spoke one unkind or abrupt word to me, and was always ready to listen and give advice on one's own silly little affairs. He was so kind and so dependable. I'm really very well now, and I think I'm now only suffering from the effects of a family breakup, which always happens when the head of a family goes. Though outwardly one's life goes on the same, yet something is different, especially spiritually and mentally." Now the Duchess would be having more responsibilities, since the king was unmarried, and Queen Mary, in mourning, would withdraw from public life for some time. The Yorks had been an essential part of King George V's court, but they weren't as close to the court established by King Edward VIII. The new king withdrew from his family and was more with his friends. This made Queen Mary and the Yorks even closer than ever. The queen had dealt with her husband's death with reserve and dignity. Anyone close to her could see she missed the king greatly, but she remained calm. May 25th, the entire family supported Queen Mary on one of her first semi-public engagements since the death of her husband. She was invited by Cunard White Star Company to see Queen Mary the day before she departed on her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. All the Queen's sons and daughters-in-laws came, and Princess Elizabeth was there too. She was anxious to see the ship. Queen Mary recorded it was a lovely day, and they were shown all over the ship, from first class to third, inspecting the swimming pool and the Turkish bath, the restaurant, the lounges, library and children's rooms, and the cabins, which Queen Mary said was very comfortable. When the king departed, his scarlet and blue biplane circled over the ship and dipped, as if in salute. The next day, May 26, it was Queen Mary's birthday, and as every year, the family gathered at Buckingham Palace for lunch. For the Queen, it was a sad occasion. King George V was dominating, but his presence was reassuring, and the unease of the new reign made the Duchess lose some of her positive spirit. After working hard all summer, the Yorks went with their daughters on their annual visit to Scotland. And this made the princesses very happy, and they spent 2 weeks at Glamis and several at Burke Hall. In early August, Queen Mary forced herself to return to Sandringham for the first time since her husband's death, and she sorted through his rooms, and the king flew up for lunch, but left immediately for London, and his mother continued her task. At Fort Belvedere, Mrs. Simpson was still dominating the king's life. Most weekends she played the part of the hostess at the fort, with or without her husband. Many of the staff hated what was going on. The king's butler was afraid of losing his job because, as he said, Mrs. S. had gotten a knife into him, and he felt he was doomed. Around May of 1936, Ernest Simpson moved out of the marital home, and the king rented Mrs. Simpson a house in Regent's Park. Divorce proceedings seemed to be coming up soon. Mrs. Simpson wasn't trusted. Whitehall officials thought her to be in the pocket of the German ambassador. Mrs. Simpson had started to read all the American papers about her. She was on a cruise with the king, and they wrote about that, and she felt that things were all too much for her to handle. She wrote the king and said she decided to return to her husband. She said to him, "I'm sure you and I would only create disaster together. I want you to be happy. I feel sure I can't make you so, and I honestly don't think you can for me." The king was horrified, and he phoned her immediately and threatened to cut his throat if she did not come to Balmoral. Stanley Baldwin on October 20th confronted the king. He said that thousands of letters had been received at Downing Street and elsewhere, and many British residents and the residents of the United States were very critical of the king's relationship with Mrs. Simpson. He asked the king if he could be more discreet and to postpone the Wallises' divorce. The king said that Baldwin had no right to interfere in the private matters of another person. And shortly after this, Alec Hardinge, the king's private secretary, felt that he should inform the Duke of York of what was happening. The Duke had felt that no matter how strong his brother's feelings were for Simpson, he would never sacrifice the throne for her. Now Hardinge informed him that the king's refusal to heed the prime minister's suggestion seemed like he would have put Mrs. Simpson before any other consideration, and abdication couldn't be ignored. The Duke and the Prince of Wales had been friends as well as brothers all their lives, and since 1923 the Duchess had added to the gaiety of their relationship. Now the king had completely cut them off. If he really planned to marry Mrs. Simpson after her divorce came through, it was clear to most of the family, though not yet to the king himself, that he could not remain on the throne. The thought that the Duke and Duchess would be the king and the queen, and that Princess Elizabeth would be heir to the throne, was terrifying. The Duke couldn't believe it was happening. Queen Mary was suffering. The country gave admiration to her as the dignified widow of the king. Within the family, she relied more and more on her other children. The Queen wrote how unsatisfactory it all is, so underhand and unpleasant. How will it end? You may imagine how worried I feel. Mrs. Simpson was getting started in her divorce on October 27th, and as the crisis built, the king continued to avoid his family. The king's private secretary, Alec Hardinge, wrote to the king to warn him that the silence of the British press on the subject of his friendship with Mrs. Simpson would last only for a matter of days, and the publicity would be calamitous. He suggested that Mrs. Simpson go abroad without further delay. This letter made the king mad, and he cut off all contact with Hardinge. The king then stated to Baldwin that he planned to marry Mrs. Simpson as soon as she was free. He would prefer to do that as king, but if he could not, he would abdicate. Baldwin was appalled and told the king, "Sir, this is most grievous news, and it is impossible for me to make any comment on it today." After talking to Baldwin, he went to dinner with his mother at Marlborough House, determined to tell her of his decision. It's not known what she said, but she commented later, "I thought I was extremely outspoken and tried to express my displeasure, but I suppose he never listened to what I said." She would never believe that Mrs. Simpson was fit to be wife, and let alone queen. Later, the queen wrote a letter to her son, but he took it as encouragement, and he wrote her saying he was relieved to tell you my wonderful secret, a dream which I have for so long been praying might one day come true. He said Wallis would be free to marry him in April, and it only remains for me to decide the best action I take for our future happiness and for the good of all concerned. The queen wrote the Duchess how worried she was about what was going on, and she asked the Duke and Duchess to come and see her, and she wanted to talk to them about it. So I'm going to end the video here. This episode showed how different the Prince of Wales was from his father, his mother, and his brother. They put their country first and did all they could to keep the country great. The prince knew early on that he didn't want to be king, and when he met Wallis, he found a way out. He knew the country would never allow him to be married to a twice-divorced American woman. He was obsessed with her, and he couldn't let her go. He didn't care about anyone else after he met her, and he turned his back on his family and remained to have his own selfish desires. So I look forward to see how everyone handled it once he committed to leaving the throne. I hope everybody liked the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help the channel out. So I wish everybody a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.